The sun had barely risen over Koudougou when Sergeant Abdoulaye Compaoré began his morning patrol along the N1 highway. At 42, he had served in the National Gendarmerie for 18 years, long enough to develop an instinct for when something was not quite right. This morning, that instinct was screaming at him as he approached the scene of what appeared to be a routine traffic accident. A large transport truck lay on its side across both lanes of the highway, its rear doors hanging open like broken jaws. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s, sat on the roadside with his head in his hands, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. The cab of the truck bore the logo of a mining equipment company based in Ouagadougou, and official paperwork visible through the shattered windshield indicated the vehicle was transporting geological survey equipment to a site near the border with Ghana. But it was what lay scattered across the highway that made Sergeant Compaoré's pulse quicken. Among the broken crates and twisted metal, small translucent stones caught the early morning light, glittering against the dark asphalt like stars against the night sky. He had grown up in Burkina Faso's mining regions and had seen enough rough diamonds in his career to recognize them immediately, even in their uncut state. The sergeant immediately radioed for backup and established a perimeter around the accident site, diverting traffic onto a side road. His training told him that the presence of unregistered diamonds could indicate anything from smuggling to illegal mining to theft from legitimate operations. In a country where gold mining had become a major industry under President Traoré's nationalization policies, the discovery of diamonds being transported without proper documentation was a serious matter. As Compaoré began photographing the scene, the truck driver became noticeably agitated. The man, who identified himself as Suleiman Ouedraogo, insisted that he knew nothing about any diamonds, that he was simply transporting equipment as he had been hired to do, that there must be some mistake. But the sergeant had heard too many lies in his career to be fooled by the driver's performance. The fear in Ouedraogo's eyes was not the confusion of an innocent man caught in unexpected circumstances. It was the terror of someone whose carefully constructed cover story was collapsing around him. Within 30 minutes, additional gendarmerie units arrived, along with officers from the National Police and, crucially, representatives from the Ministry of Mines. The presence of precious stones on a public highway triggered multiple jurisdictions, each with its own protocols and concerns, but all recognized that this discovery was significant enough to warrant immediate notification to higher authorities. Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Caboret, the regional gendarmerie commander, took charge of the scene. He was a stern man in his early 50s, known for his incorruptibility in a system where bribery was often standard practice. Caboret had served under 3 different governments and had survived by maintaining strict adherence to the law, regardless of which faction held power. He ordered a complete search of the truck and a thorough collection of all diamonds visible on the highway. The search revealed something that transformed the situation from serious to explosive. Hidden within false compartments built into equipment crates, investigators found carefully packaged parcels containing thousands of rough diamonds. The stones varied in size from small fragments to pieces as large as a man's thumb. Preliminary estimates suggested the cash could be worth millions of dollars on the international market, possibly tens of millions, depending on quality and cut. Chapter 2. As word of the discovery spread through official channels, panic rippled through a network of people who had believed their operation was secure. The diamonds were not from Burkina Faso's largely unexploited deposits, but rather had been smuggled from neighboring countries where armed groups and corrupt officials controlled diamond-rich regions. The truck was supposed to be a routine transfer, moving the stones from a storage facility in Ouagadougou to a border crossing where they would be smuggled into Ghana and eventually make their way to international markets with falsified certificates of origin. The operation represented everything that President Ibrahim Traoré had vowed to eliminate: the exploitation of Africa's resources by criminal networks that enriched a few while impoverishing nations. Since taking power, Traoré had made resource nationalism a central pillar of his governance, nationalizing gold mines and demanding that Burkina Faso's mineral wealth serve its own people rather than foreign corporations and their local enablers. At the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Traoré was in an early morning security briefing when his chief of staff interrupted with news of the highway discovery. The president listened intently as the details were relayed, his expression hardening as he understood the implications. This was not a small-scale smuggling operation run by desperate artisanal miners trying to survive. The sophistication of the concealment, the volume of stones, and the use of legitimate mining company documentation suggested involvement by powerful players with access to resources and connections. Traoré's first question was characteristically direct. Had anyone been contacted offering bribes to make the discovery disappear? His chief of staff confirmed that within an hour of the seizure, Lieutenant Colonel Traoré had received 3 phone calls from unknown numbers, each offering progressively larger sums of money in exchange for releasing the driver and allowing the truck to continue its journey. Traoré had documented each call and reported them immediately. The president made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He ordered the entire N1 highway sealed from Koudougou to the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a stretch of nearly 100 kilometers. No vehicles would be allowed to pass in either direction until a complete investigation had been conducted. He mobilized a special task force comprising the gendarmerie, military intelligence, and customs officials to track every person and company connected to the truck, the diamonds, and the attempted bribes. The highway closure created immediate chaos. The N1 was Burkina Faso's main artery, connecting the capital to the country's second-largest city, Bobo-Dioulasso. Thousands of travelers found themselves stranded, cargo shipments were delayed, and businesses dependent on the road's commerce faced sudden disruption. Complaints poured into government offices and social media exploded with speculation about what could justify such an extreme measure. But Traoré was unmoved by the inconvenience. He had learned from his military experience fighting terrorists in the north that half measures achieved nothing. If there was a cancer of corruption eating at Burkina Faso's attempts to control its own resources, it needed to be cut out completely, regardless of the short-term pain. He had promised the Burkinabe people that their mineral wealth would serve national development, not line the pockets of criminals and corrupt officials. This was the moment to prove that promise was real. The president traveled to Koudougou personally, arriving by helicopter 4 hours after the initial discovery. His security detail had recommended against the trip, arguing that whoever was behind the smuggling operation might have the resources to mount an attack on the presidential convoy. But Traoré had built his political identity on direct engagement with issues rather than remote management from the palace. The people needed to see that their president was personally committed to rooting out corruption. Chapter 3. At the accident site, Traoré walked slowly along the highway, examining the diamonds that had been carefully collected and catalogued by forensic teams. Each stone had been photographed, measured and placed in numbered evidence bags. The sheer quantity was staggering. Preliminary counts suggested over 50,000 individual stones, ranging from tiny fragments to substantial rough diamonds that would yield impressive gems once cut. The president crouched beside one of the evidence containers, picking up a bag that held a particularly large stone, perhaps 15 carats in its rough state. He held it up to the sunlight, watching how the light refracted through the irregular crystal structure. In his hand, he held compressed carbon that had formed over millions of years deep beneath the earth, wealth that could build schools and hospitals, that could fund agricultural development and infrastructure projects. Instead, it had been destined for the jewelry boxes of wealthy consumers in Europe, Asia, and North America, with the profits flowing to criminal networks rather than the African people from whose land it came. Lieutenant Colonel Traoré briefed the president on what had been learned so far. The truck driver, Solimani Ouedraogo, had initially refused to talk, demanding a lawyer and insisting he was simply following orders. But faced with charges that could result in decades in prison, he had begun to crack. According to his preliminary statement, he had been hired by an intermediary he knew only as Amadou, who paid him 5 million CFA francs, approximately $8,000, to transport what he was told was mining equipment to the Ghanaian border. Ouedraogo claimed he had not known about the diamonds hidden in the crates, though this assertion was undermined by the discovery of 50,000 CFA francs in cash taped under his driver's seat and messages on his phone discussing payment schedules and delivery confirmation protocols. The intermediary Amadou had communicated exclusively through encrypted messaging apps and burner phones, demonstrating a level of operational security that suggested professional criminal organization rather than amateur smuggling. More troubling were the documents found in the truck's cab. Among the legitimate transportation papers was a letter on official Ministry of Mines letterhead. signed by someone claiming to be a deputy director, authorizing the transport of geological samples for analysis in Ghana. The signature was authentic. Government handwriting analysts had already confirmed it matched the official's known signature. This meant either the deputy director was complicit in the smuggling, or someone with access to his office had forged his signature on official documents. Traoré's jaw tightened as he processed this information. He had inherited a government riddled with corruption from previous administrations, and despite his efforts at reform, the rot ran deeper than he had fully appreciated. The Ministry of Mines was supposed to be at the forefront of his resource nationalism agenda, implementing policies that ensured mineral wealth served national interests. If corruption had penetrated that ministry, it threatened the legitimacy of everything he was trying to achieve. The president made a second decision that shocked even his closest advisors. He ordered the immediate suspension of all officials in the Ministry of Mines above the rank of department head, pending investigation. He placed the deputy director, whose signature appeared on the authorization letter, under house arrest, and assigned military intelligence to surveil everyone in that person's professional and personal network. The presumption would not be innocence unless proven guilty, but rather that everyone was suspect until definitively cleared. Civil society organizations and international observers would later criticize this approach as heavy-handed, potentially violating due process and creating a climate of fear within the government bureaucracy. But Traoré was operating from a different calculus. He had seen how corruption destroyed nations, how it diverted resources from the poor to the wealthy, how it undermined public trust in institutions. In his view, extraordinary corruption required extraordinary measures to combat it, even if those measures made some people uncomfortable. Chapter 4. As investigators expanded their inquiry, the scope of the smuggling operation became clearer. The diamonds had originated from multiple sources across West and Central Africa. Some came from the Central African Republic, where armed groups controlled diamond-rich regions and used gem sales to fund their operations. Others came from areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where artisanal miners worked in conditions that often involved forced labor, including children. Still others were traced to Guinea and Sierra Leone, countries with tragic histories of diamond-funded conflicts. The smuggling network operated through a sophisticated system that exploited Burkina Faso's position as a landlocked country bordered by 6 nations. Diamonds would be brought across poorly monitored borders, often hidden among legitimate trade goods, or carried by couriers who could blend into the constant flow of regional commerce. Once in Burkina Faso, the stones would be consolidated, repackaged, and prepared for export with falsified documentation, claiming they originated from legitimate operations. The choice of Burkina Faso as a transit point was strategic. The country had substantial gold mining operations but minimal diamond production, which meant customs officials were trained to look for gold smuggling but had limited expertise in diamond identification. The network had apparently calculated that it was easier to move diamonds through a country where they were unexpected than through diamond-producing nations with more sophisticated monitoring systems. Cell phone records seized from the truck driver led investigators to a network of contacts that spanned 4 countries and included merchants, customs officials, border guards, and at least 3 individuals working in mining ministry offices across the region. The digital trail revealed a criminal enterprise that had been operating for at least 3 years, moving an estimated $500 million worth of rough diamonds through West Africa to international markets. The investigation also revealed something more disturbing. The network had protectors in positions of power who ensured operations could continue without interruption. Encrypted messages discussed payments to unnamed officials, references to protection arrangements, and confidence that even if lower-level operatives were caught, the organization could secure their release through well-placed bribes and political pressure. This was the context in which Traoré's decision to seal the highway and suspend ministry officials made strategic sense. He was not just investigating a single smuggling operation, but rather attempting to destroy an entire criminal ecosystem that had embedded itself within Burkina Faso's institutions. The highway closure was not merely about collecting evidence from one accident site. It was about creating a controlled environment where the network could not move assets, communicate warnings, or destroy evidence. As the investigation progressed through its second day, pressure on the president to reopen the highway intensified. Business leaders complained about economic losses, transport companies threatened legal action, and opposition politicians accused Traoré of using the situation as an excuse to demonstrate authoritarian power. International partners expressed concern about the disruption to regional trade, with particularly strong objections from Ghana, which relied on the N1 for imports from Burkina Faso and transit access to other West African markets. But the most significant pressure came from within Traoré's own government. Senior officials who had not been suspended, but who understood that the investigation might eventually reach them, began a quiet campaign to convince the president that he was overreacting. They argued that the discovery of one smuggling operation did not justify paralyzing a major highway, that the economic damage outweighed any potential benefits from the investigation, that Burkina Faso's fragile economy could not afford such disruptions. Chapter 5. On the evening of the second day, Traoré convened an emergency meeting of his National Security Council at the presidential palace. The attendees included military leaders, intelligence chiefs, the Minister of Justice, the acting head of the Ministry of Mines, and key advisors. The atmosphere was tense as officials took their seats around the conference table, knowing that the president's decisions in the coming hours would shape not just the investigation but potentially his entire presidency. Traoré began by reviewing what had been discovered: 50,000 diamonds, sophisticated smuggling infrastructure, corruption reaching into government ministries, and connections to armed groups in neighboring countries. He then posed a direct question to the council: should Burkina Faso compromise with corruption for the sake of economic convenience, or should it accept short-term pain to establish a precedent that the country's resources would not be stolen? The Minister of Commerce argued passionately for reopening the highway. He presented economic analyses, showing that each day of closure cost the national economy approximately 2 billion CFA francs in lost trade, delayed shipments, and cancelled transactions. He emphasized that Burkina Faso was trying to attract investment and build its reputation as a stable business environment. Actions like indefinite highway closures sent exactly the wrong message to potential investors. The military intelligence chief countered with a different perspective. His teams had been monitoring communications among suspected network members, and the intercepts showed rising panic as the organization realized it could not operate under the current restrictions. Several key figures had attempted to flee the country, but were caught at borders that had been alerted to watch for them. The network was fragmenting, with lower-level participants becoming willing to provide information in exchange for leniency. If the pressure was maintained for just a few more days, intelligence services believed they could map the entire operation and make arrests that would cripple it permanently. The Minister of Justice raised legal concerns. While he supported aggressive prosecution of corruption, he worried that some of the president's measures might not survive court challenges. Suspending dozens of officials without specific evidence against each individual could be ruled unconstitutional. House arrest without formal charges violated due process. If cases were built on evidence collected through legally questionable methods, defense attorneys might succeed in having that evidence excluded, allowing guilty parties to escape justice on technicalities. Traoré listened to all perspectives before speaking. His response demonstrated the quality that had made him a successful military commander and, for many Burkinabés, an inspiring leader. He acknowledged the validity of every concern raised, including those arguing for reopening the highway. He admitted that his approach carried risks, both legal and economic, but he returned to a fundamental principle. If Burkina Faso's leaders were not willing to sacrifice convenience to combat corruption, then all the rhetoric about resource nationalism and serving the people was empty performance. The president made his position clear through a parable. He described a man whose house has termites. The man can see the damage the termites are causing, but hesitates to fumigate because the treatment requires temporarily evacuating the house, which is inconvenient and expensive. So he lives with the termites, watching them eat away at the structure, until one day the house collapses. Traoré argued that corruption was Burkina Faso's termite infestation, and yes, treatment would be painful and disruptive, but the alternative was watching the nation's foundations crumble. He announced that the highway would remain closed for 3 more days, giving investigators time to complete their initial work. During this period, a special prosecutor would be appointed with authority to bring charges based on evidence gathered. Any officials against whom credible evidence emerged would be formally charged. Those cleared would be reinstated with apologies and compensation for their suspension, and the message would go out clearly. Burkina Faso was done tolerating theft of its resources, regardless of who was involved or how powerful their connections. Chapter 6. The following morning, Traoré made an unprecedented decision. He would address the nation directly from the accident site on the N1 highway, standing beside the truck that had spilled its illegal cargo. State television and radio would broadcast the speech live, and it would be streamed on social media platforms where younger Burkinabé increasingly received their news. When the president arrived at Koudougou, a crowd had gathered despite the ongoing highway closure. Word had spread through the region that something significant was happening, and people had walked or ridden motorcycles to see the scene for themselves. Security forces maintained a perimeter, but Traoré ordered them to allow citizens to observe from a distance. He wanted people to witness what had been discovered, to see with their own eyes the evidence of how their nation's wealth was being stolen. Standing before cameras with the overturned truck behind him and evidence containers of diamonds visible, Traoré delivered one of the most important speeches of his presidency. He spoke in Mooré, the language of Burkina Faso's largest ethnic group, rather than French, the official language. This choice was deliberate, signaling that he was speaking to ordinary Burkinabé rather than to international audiences or the educated elite. The president explained what the diamonds represented: wealth that should have improved lives, built schools, funded healthcare, supported agriculture. Instead, this wealth had been stolen by criminals who enriched themselves while millions of Burkinabé struggled with poverty. He acknowledged that closing the highway created hardship for travelers and businesses, and he apologized for this inconvenience. But he asked citizens to consider what kind of country they wanted to build: one where corruption was tolerated for the sake of convenience, or one where justice was pursued, even when it was difficult. Traoré then made a promise that would define the rest of his presidency. He pledged that every diamond recovered from the highway would be sold through proper government channels, with the proceeds going into a special fund dedicated to education in rural areas. The fund would build schools, train teachers, provide scholarships, and ensure that children across Burkina Faso had opportunities their parents never had. The theft that had been uncovered would be transformed into investment in the nation's future. The speech resonated powerfully across Burkina Faso and beyond. Social media erupted with discussions, hashtags, and debates. Supporters praised Traoré principled stand against corruption, his willingness to endure criticism for doing what he believed was right, his creative solution of turning confiscated wealth into educational opportunity. Critics maintained their objections about economic disruption and legal overreach, but even many critics acknowledged that the president's commitment appeared genuine. Caso esteja gostando dessa história, considere se inscrever no canal para que possamos continuar trazendo cada vez mais conteúdo para você. Chapter 7. As investigators worked around the clock, the web of connections expanded further than anyone had anticipated. The smuggling network had tentacles reaching into 4 countries and involved not just criminals but business people who maintained legitimate operations as cover for illegal activities. Mining companies that appeared legitimate on paper were revealed to be fronts for laundering smuggled diamonds. Transport firms had entire fleets of trucks modified with hidden compartments. Border posts that should have been inspecting cargo had officers on the payroll who waved certain trucks through without examination. The investigation uncovered ledgers showing that the network had moved over $800 million worth of diamonds through West Africa over 3 years. Only a tiny fraction of that wealth had remained in the region. The vast majority flowed to international buyers in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, who either did not ask questions about the stones, origins, or actively preferred the discount prices that smuggled diamonds commanded. Among the most troubling discoveries was evidence of connections to armed groups in the Central African Republic and Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Some of the diamonds had directly funded militias responsible for atrocities, including massacres, sexual violence, and forced displacement of communities. By purchasing and smuggling these stones, the network had become complicit in violence that had killed thousands and destroyed countless lives. This revelation added a moral dimension to the investigation beyond simple corruption. These were not just stolen resources. They were blood diamonds that carried the suffering of people who had been terrorized by the very groups that profited from their extraction. For Traoré, whose political identity was shaped by fighting terrorism and protecting Burkina Faso's sovereignty, the connection between the smuggled diamonds and armed groups made the investigation deeply personal. The president authorized expanded cooperation with international law enforcement, something he had previously been reluctant to do given his nationalist stance toward Western involvement in African affairs. But he recognized that a criminal network operating across borders required coordinated international response. Interpol became involved, as did law enforcement agencies from countries where the diamonds had ultimately been sold. As arrests began, the network started to collapse from within. Lower-level operatives, facing serious prison sentences, became willing to provide testimony against more senior figures in exchange for reduced charges. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had studied organized crime. The foot soldiers turned on the lieutenants, who turned on the captains, who began pointing fingers at those who had funded and directed the operation. By the fourth day of the highway closure, investigators had identified 37 individuals for immediate arrest, including 5 current or former government officials, 12 business people operating in the mining and transport sectors, 8 border control officers across 3 countries, and 12 others involved in various supporting roles. More names were being developed as the investigation continued, with expectations that the final number could exceed 100. The arrests made international headlines. News organizations around the world reported on the young African president who had shut down a major highway to combat diamond smuggling, comparing him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who had renamed Upper Volta to Burkina Faso and attempted to create a society free from corruption before his assassination in 1987. For some, Traoré represented hope for a new generation of African leadership committed to genuine reform. For others, he was a worrying example of authoritarian tendencies disguised as anti-corruption efforts. Chapter. On the 5th day, Traoré reopened the N1 highway, ending the closure 2 days earlier than he had announced. The decision came after investigators confirmed they had collected all necessary evidence from the accident site and completed their initial mapping of the criminal network. Long lines of trucks and cars that had been waiting on both sides of the closure zone began moving again, creating a traffic jam that took hours to clear but was greeted with relief by travelers who had been stranded. The economic impact of the 5-day closure was significant. The Ministry of Commerce estimated total costs at approximately 10 billion CFA francs, or roughly $16 million, including lost trade, spoiled perishable goods, cancelled contracts, and penalties from delays. Business organizations demanded that the government compensate companies for their losses, arguing that citizens should not bear the financial burden of the president's political decisions. But Traoré's approval ratings told a different story. Polling conducted during and immediately after the highway closure showed that 68% of Burkinabés supported the president's actions, with support highest among rural residents and young people. Many citizens expressed pride that their country was taking a stand against corruption, even at economic cost. The sentiment was particularly strong among those who felt that previous governments had promised to fight corruption but never followed through with concrete action. The trial preparations began immediately. Burkina Faso's legal system, like those of many former French colonies, followed civil law procedures that allowed for relatively quick movement from arrest to trial. The special prosecutor appointed by Traoré assembled a team of attorneys and began building cases against the arrested individuals, prioritizing those where evidence was strongest and the accused held the most senior positions in the network. Among those facing charges was the deputy director of the Ministry of Mines, whose signature had appeared on the authorization letter found in the truck. His arrest had been dramatic, with television cameras capturing the moment when gendarmerie officers arrived at his office in Ouagadougou. The official had protested his innocence loudly, claiming he had been framed, that his signature had been forged or obtained through deception. But subsequent investigation revealed bank accounts in his name containing far more money than his government salary could explain, along with encrypted communications discussing diamond shipments. The cases against border control officers were particularly strong. Several had been caught on surveillance footage, allowing the trucks through their checkpoints without inspection, sometimes while receiving envelopes that investigators believed contained bribes. Phone records showed communications, coordinating the timing of shipments with officers, work schedules to ensure the right people were on duty when smuggling vehicles arrived. Some officers had resigned immediately upon learning of the investigation, fleeing to neighboring countries where they hoped to avoid prosecution. As the legal processes unfolded, Traoré faced the challenge of ensuring that trials were fair while also satisfying public demand for swift justice. The president understood that if the accused were treated unjustly, it would undermine the moral foundation of the entire effort. He could not become the kind of leader who used anti-corruption rhetoric to punish enemies while protecting allies. The investigation had to be genuinely about justice, not political theater. To that end, Traoré took the unusual step of authorizing international observers to monitor the trials. Representatives from Transparency International, the African Union, and the United Nations were invited to attend proceedings and report on whether defendants received due process. This transparency was risky. It meant that any irregularities would be publicly exposed, but the president calculated that building credibility required accepting external scrutiny. Chapter 9. As trials began in Ouagadougou's main courthouse, they became a national spectacle. State television broadcast proceedings live, with millions of Burkinabe watching as prosecutors presented evidence and defense attorneys cross-examined witnesses. The trials revealed details about how the smuggling operation had functioned, the scope of corruption within government agencies, and the connections between criminal networks and legitimate businesses. One trial in particular captured public attention, that of the deputy director of the Ministry of Mines. The official Khan, whose name was Issouf Sankara, had been a respected figure with a doctoral degree in geology and 20 years of government service. He came from a prominent family and had cultivated an image as a reformer committed to ensuring Burkina Faso's mineral wealth served national interests. His fall from grace was therefore especially dramatic. The prosecution's case against Sankara was comprehensive. Bank records showed deposits totaling over 200 million CFA francs across 3 years, far exceeding his official salary. Several of these deposits occurred within days of when smuggling trucks had passed through checkpoints with documentation bearing his signature. Witnesses testified about meetings where Sankara had discussed facilitating diamond shipments in exchange for payment. Phone records showed communications with known smuggling network members using coded language that experts interpreted as discussions of illegal transactions. Sankara's defense argued that he was being scapegoated, that powerful people had framed him to protect themselves. His attorney claimed the bank deposits were legitimate income from consulting work and family gifts. The signatures on authorization documents, the defense suggested, had been forged by someone with access to official paperwork. The phone communications were taken out of context, according to the defense, and represented legitimate discussions about mining policy rather than criminal conspiracy. The trial lasted 3 weeks and featured testimony from over 40 witnesses. Investigative journalists covered every development, with daily analyses of the evidence and speculation about the verdict. Social media was consumed with debates about Sankara's guilt, with some arguing he was obviously corrupt, while others maintained reasonable doubt remained. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was packed with spectators, media, and observers. The presiding judge read from a detailed decision that evaluated each piece of evidence and the credibility of witnesses. The conclusion was unambiguous. Sankara was guilty of corruption, abuse of office, and facilitating criminal activity. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, ordered to repay all illicit funds identified in his accounts, and permanently banned from government employment. The verdict sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso's bureaucracy. If someone as prominent and well-connected as Sankara could be convicted and imprisoned, it meant that no one was untouchable. Other trials of less senior officials followed, with most resulting in convictions, though a few defendants were acquitted when evidence proved insufficient. The message was clear. Corruption would be prosecuted aggressively, but within the bounds of law and evidence. International reaction to the trials was mixed. Some observers praised Burkina Faso for demonstrating that African nations could combat corruption without external intervention, using their own legal systems and institutions. Others criticized aspects of the process, including the speed of trials and concerns about whether defendants had adequate time to prepare defenses. Human rights organizations noted that while the trials appeared generally fair, the initial detention of suspects and suspension of officials had raised due process concerns. Chapter 10. 6 months after the accident on the N1 highway, the special fund created from the sale of recovered diamonds held over 12 billion CFA francs, approximately $19 million. The diamonds had been sold through proper channels to certified buyers who verified their legal acquisition, with the government accepting lower prices than the stones might have commanded on black markets, but gaining legitimacy in exchange. Traoré traveled to rural areas across Burkina Faso to inaugurate the first projects funded by the diamond proceeds. In a village 200 kilometers from Ouagadougou, he cut the ribbon on a new school building that could accommodate 300 students. The school featured solar panels for electricity, a library stocked with books in both French and local languages, science laboratories with modern equipment, and housing for teachers to ensure the facility could attract qualified educators. At the inauguration ceremony, Traoré spoke about the journey from corruption to development. He pointed to the school and explained that this building existed because Burkina Faso had chosen to fight theft of its resources rather than tolerate it. He acknowledged the hardship caused by the highway closure and the disruption to economic activity, but he asked villagers to consider whether their children's education was worth that cost. The response was enthusiastic applause and chanting of slogans supporting the president's anti-corruption efforts. Similar scenes played out across the country as additional schools were built, existing facilities renovated, teacher training programs established, and scholarship funds created for students from poor families. The Diamond Fund became a tangible demonstration of what could be achieved when stolen wealth was recovered and redirected toward public benefit. It provided Traoré with a powerful counter-narrative to critics who focused on the economic costs of his aggressive approach to corruption. But the president was under no illusions that one successful operation meant corruption had been defeated. The investigation into the diamond smuggling network had revealed how deeply criminal enterprises had embedded themselves within Burkina Faso's institutions. Rooting out all corruption would require sustained effort over years, constant vigilance, and willingness to accept that setbacks and failures would occur along the way. Traoré initiated broader reforms based on lessons from the diamond case. The Ministry of Mines was restructured with new leadership, revised procedures for authorizing shipments, and strengthened oversight mechanisms. Border controls were enhanced with better training for officers, improved equipment for inspecting cargo, and rotation policies designed to prevent customs officials from becoming too comfortable in positions where they might be corrupted. The legal framework for prosecuting smuggling and corruption was updated to close loopholes that had been exploited by defense attorneys. These reforms faced resistance from multiple directions. Some officials resented the implication that they needed more oversight, interpreting it as distrust of their professionalism. Business interests complained that enhanced inspections slowed commerce and created unnecessary bureaucracy. International partners worried that Burkina Faso's aggressive stance might create tensions with neighboring countries whose officials had been implicated in the smuggling network. The president addressed these concerns through a combination of direct engagement and principled firmness. He met with business leaders to explain that legitimate commerce would not be impeded, but that Burkina Faso would no longer be a convenient transit point for smuggling. He engaged diplomatically with neighboring countries, proposing regional cooperation on combating criminal networks rather than trying to impose unilateral solutions. And he made clear to his own officials that resistance to anti-corruption reforms would be interpreted as suspicious, encouraging self-interested parties to find different employment. Chapter 11. The long-term impact of the highway incident extended beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The aggressive prosecution of the diamond smuggling network sent ripples through criminal enterprises operating across West Africa. Intelligence reports indicated that several smuggling operations had suspended activities or shifted routes to avoid Burkina Faso, fearing they might face similar exposure and prosecution. Regional organizations took note of Traoré's approach. At an Economic Community of West African States summit 6 months after the incident, several heads of state praised Burkina Faso's anti-corruption efforts and proposed coordinated regional action against smuggling networks. This represented a significant shift. Previously, discussions of cross-border crime had been hampered by sensitivities about national sovereignty and reluctance to acknowledge domestic corruption. Traoré's willingness to publicly confront these issues created space for more honest regional dialogue. However, the president also faced mounting challenges from powerful interests affected by his policies. Mining companies that had enjoyed favorable arrangements under previous governments found themselves subject to stricter regulation and higher taxes. Some responded by threatening to relocate operations to other countries with more accommodating policies. Traoré's response was pragmatic. Companies that wanted to operate legally and contribute fairly to Burkina Faso's development were welcome, but those seeking to exploit the country's resources while avoiding obligations should indeed go elsewhere. This stance carried economic risks. Foreign direct investment, crucial for Burkina Faso's development, was sensitive to perceptions of business climate and regulatory stability. Some potential investors were deterred by the president's assertive resource nationalism and anti-corruption crackdowns, viewing them as unpredictable interference in business operations. The government's revenue from mining operations dipped temporarily as some companies reduced production or delayed planned expansions. But Traoré bet that long-term benefits of establishing rule of law and resource control would outweigh short-term costs. He argued that sustainable development required foundations of integrity, that foreign investment built on corruption was ultimately extractive rather than beneficial. This was a contested economic philosophy, with legitimate experts disagreeing about whether his approach would succeed. The president acknowledged uncertainty, but maintained that Burkina Faso's previous path of tolerating corruption while hoping for development had clearly failed. Within Burkina Faso, the political impact of the diamond case was profound. Traoré's approval ratings remained elevated, particularly among demographics that had historically felt excluded from governance: young people, rural residents, women, and the poor. These groups saw the president as someone who prioritized their interests over those of elites, who was willing to confront powerful people when they engaged in wrongdoing, and who backed up rhetoric with concrete action. However, the president also faced growing opposition from those who felt threatened by his methods or disagreed with his priorities. Business leaders formed advocacy organizations demanding policy changes. Opposition politicians criticized what they characterized as authoritarian tendencies, disguised as anti-corruption measures. International partners expressed concerns about democratic backsliding, pointing to the suspension of officials without charges and rapid trials that might not have allowed adequate defense preparation. Traoré engaged with these critiques selectively. He dismissed criticisms from those he believed were motivated by self-interest, particularly from business figures implicated in corrupt practices. But he took seriously concerns about democratic processes and rule of law, recognizing that his legitimacy depended on operating within constitutional constraints, even while pushing the boundaries of executive authority. Chapter 12. 1 year after the accident that spilled diamonds across the N1 highway, Burkina Faso held a national commemoration event. Traoré returned to Koudougou, where a monument had been erected near the site of the discovery. The monument featured a sculpture of a broken truck with diamonds spilling from it, symbolizing both the theft that had been exposed and the wealth that had been recovered for the nation's benefit. At the commemoration, the president reflected on the journey from discovery to prosecution to recovery. He acknowledged the costs, the economic disruption from closing the highway, the diplomatic tensions created by prosecuting officials from multiple countries, the ongoing challenges of implementing reforms in resistant systems. But he also catalogued the gains: over 100 criminals prosecuted, dozens of corrupt officials removed from positions of power, 12 billion CFA francs recovered and invested in education, and a clear message sent that Burkina Faso would protect its resources. The president introduced several people whose lives had been directly affected by the Diamond Fund. A young woman named Fatimata Sawadago, whose village had received one of the new schools, spoke about how access to quality education was changing her community. Previously, the nearest school had been a 2-hour walk away, and many families could not afford to send children that distance daily. Now, with a modern facility in the village, enrollment had tripled, and students were receiving education that prepared them for university and professional careers. A teacher named Ibrahim Traoré, who had received training funded by the diamond proceeds, described how the program had transformed his ability to educate students. He had learned new teaching methods, received updated materials, and been equipped with technology that brought the wider world into his rural classroom. His students were learning not just to memorize facts, but to think critically, to ask questions, to imagine futures beyond the limited opportunities their parents had known. These testimonials provided the emotional counterpoint to debates about economic policy and legal procedures. They reminded audiences why the fight against corruption mattered, not as an abstract principle, but as a practical necessity for creating the conditions where people could thrive. The diamonds that had been destined for wealthy consumers in distant countries had instead become educational opportunities for Burkina Faso's children, and that transformation represented what governance could achieve when leaders prioritized public interest over private enrichment. Yet Traoré was realistic about the limits of what had been accomplished. One successful operation against one smuggling network, however significant, did not mean corruption had been eliminated. Criminal enterprises were adaptive, finding new routes and methods when old ones were shut down. Corrupt officials who had escaped prosecution continued to undermine reform efforts from within the system. The fundamental challenges of poverty, limited state capacity, and external pressures that created environments where corruption flourished remained largely unchanged. The president spoke honestly about these limitations in his commemoration address. He described the fight against corruption not as a battle that could be won through a single decisive action, but as an ongoing struggle requiring constant vigilance, repeated efforts, and acceptance that progress would be incremental rather than revolutionary. He called on Burkinabe citizens to remain engaged, to demand accountability from their leaders, and to resist the cynicism that suggested corruption was simply the way things had to be. As the sun set over Koudougou, casting long shadows across the monument and the highway where diamonds had once spilled from a broken truck, Traoré stood quietly with his thoughts. He had made difficult decisions that carried significant costs and uncertain long-term benefits. He had confronted powerful interests and created enemies who would seek opportunities to undermine him. He had staked his presidency on the proposition that African nations could govern themselves with integrity, that resources could serve populations rather than criminal networks, that a different future was possible. Whether history would judge these choices as wise or reckless remained to be seen. The outcomes would depend on countless factors, whether reformed institutions remained resistant to corruption, whether economic development could be achieved through legitimate means, whether citizens maintained their support for difficult reforms, whether regional partners cooperated rather than competed in a race to the bottom. The president carried no illusions that success was guaranteed, but as Traoré looked at the families gathered around the monument, at the school children who had traveled from across the region to participate in the commemoration, at the teachers and community leaders who had invested the diamond funds in building a better future, he felt confident that the struggle was worthwhile. The accident that had spilled diamonds across the N1 highway had revealed a theft that was stealing Burkina Faso's future. By choosing to fight that theft rather than ignore it, the president and his nation had demonstrated that different choices were possible, that corruption was not inevitable, that African countries could chart their own paths toward justice and development. The road ahead would be long and difficult, marked by setbacks and challenges that could not yet be foreseen. But it was a road that led somewhere worth going, and Ibrahim Traoré had proven willing to travel it regardless of the obstacles. For the Burkinabe people watching their young president stand beside a monument built from recovered stolen wealth, now transformed into educational opportunity, that willingness was itself a source of hope, a reminder that leadership mattered and that nations could change when their leaders chose justice over convenience. As darkness fell and the commemoration concluded, the highway resumed its normal function, carrying goods and passengers across Burkina Faso's landscape. But those who passed the monument would remember the day when diamonds spilled across this road, when a president ordered it sealed, and when a nation chose to fight for its future rather than accept theft as inevitable. That memory would endure, shaping Burkina Faso's story and offering an example to a continent still struggling to ensure that its immense wealth served its own people rather than enriching those who sought to steal it.